Sometimes fate doesn't ask who you love. It only asks how much you're willing to lose before someone finally stands beside you. The antique clock in the center of the Halcyon Grand Hotel chimed once, its polished brass hands resting at exactly noon as every conversation inside the ballroom dissolved into an uneasy silence. Miles Ashford stood alone beneath the enormous crystal chandelier, feeling hundreds of unfamiliar eyes settle on him at once. He had never liked crowds. He preferred quiet rooms lined with old books, faded maps, and carefully labeled archives where history remained still and predictable. Today, history had chosen to become something else entirely. The attorney cleared his throat and unfolded a yellow document sealed with dark blue wax. This is the final testament of Walter Ashford. The name alone carried weight throughout the city. Walter had been respected for preserving historic neighborhoods and funding charities that quietly changed lives without asking for recognition. To Miles, however, he had simply been Grandpa, the only person who ever reminded him that kindness was never weakness. The lawyer continued reading, describing the Ashford house, the charitable foundation, and every property that would legally belong to Miles. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Reporters immediately began whispering while several business leaders exchanged surprised looks. Miles barely heard any of it. He was still thinking about the old library where his grandfather had taught him how to repair torn pages with patient hands. Then the lawyer paused. His expression shifted. There is one final condition. Every camera rose. Every voice disappeared. The heir must enter into a lawful marriage before reaching the age of 25. If this condition is not fulfilled, all management authority over the Ashford estate shall immediately transfer to Mr. Gavin Ashford until further notice. Miles frowned. That can't be right. His birthday was tomorrow. The lawyer slowly looked toward him with visible sympathy. According to the legal filing, you have exactly 24 hours remaining. The room exploded into whispers. Miles felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. 24 hours. That was less than the time required to organize a community fundraiser, let alone find someone willing to build a future together. Gavin Ashford stepped forward wearing an expensive charcoal suit and a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. There's no reason to panic, Miles. Fortunately, I've already arranged a solution. Beside him stood Preston Vale, a successful attorney with perfectly styled hair and a confident expression that somehow made Miles even more uncomfortable. Preston smiled politely. We've known each other for years, Miles. A practical marriage would satisfy the legal requirement. It protects the estate and keeps everything in the family. I never agreed to that, Miles answered quietly. Gavin sighed as though disappointed by a stubborn child. You don't have the luxury of waiting for romance. This is about responsibility. Something inside Miles tightened. Responsibility. The word had followed him since childhood, usually spoken by people who wanted something from him. He glanced toward the attorney. Why wasn't I informed earlier? An awkward silence answered him. The notification, the attorney admitted carefully, appears to have been delivered only yesterday. Yesterday. Impossible. Grandpa had passed away months ago. Someone had delayed the notice. Someone had wanted him trapped. June Calloway, his closest friend from the city archives, pushed through the crowd and whispered, Miles, this feels wrong. He nodded without taking his eyes off Gavin. Everything felt wrong. The deadline. Preston's convenient appearance. The carefully rehearsed confidence in Gavin's voice. It all fit together too neatly. Miles reached into his coat pocket and wrapped his fingers around the small bronze key his grandfather had given him years earlier with only one instruction. Keep it safe until the truth needs you. He had never understood what that meant. Maybe today was the beginning. Reporters moved closer. Flashbulbs burst across the ballroom. Someone shouted whether he intended to accept Preston's proposal. Another asked if the Ashford fortune was about to collapse. The questions blended together until they became meaningless noise. Miles looked around the crowded room filled with wealthy strangers who seemed far more interested in the estate than the frightened man standing beneath the chandelier. His voice trembled despite every effort to remain composed. "I have 24 hours to find a husband." The words echoed through the silent ballroom. No one answered. Some guests looked away. Others exchanged uncomfortable smiles. A few quietly laughed, convinced the situation had become entertainment. Then a chair scraped softly across the marble floor. Every head turned toward the back of the room. A tall man dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit rose without the slightest hint of hesitation. His calm presence seemed to quiet the entire ballroom before he spoke a single word. Silver cufflinks reflected the chandelier above as he buttoned his jacket and walked forward with measured confidence. Even those who had never met him recognized him immediately. Damien Rourke. The man whose name carried equal parts respect and caution throughout the city. He stopped a few feet from Miles, meeting his uncertain eyes with an expression impossible to read. The silence stretched until even the cameras stopped clicking. Finally, Damien spoke in a steady voice that reached every corner of the ballroom. "Then," he said, "you've already found one." No one spoke until Damien extended a simple black business card toward Miles. "If you are willing," he said evenly, "we should discuss the details somewhere quieter." The ballroom remained frozen as if every guest had forgotten how to breathe. Gavin recovered first. "Mr. Rourke, this is a private family matter." Damien glanced at him with calm indifference. "The moment you made it public, it stopped being private." There was no anger in his voice, only quiet certainty, and somehow that made the words carry even more weight. Miles looked from Damien to Gavin, then to Preston, whose polished smile had begun to fade for the first time all afternoon. June gently touched Miles's sleeve. "You do not owe anyone an answer out here," she whispered. Miles nodded. "I will hear what he has to say." Gavin stepped forward. "That would be a mistake." "Perhaps," Miles answered, "but it will be my mistake to make." For the first time that day, Gavin had no immediate response. Damien led Miles through a private hallway overlooking the city skyline before stopping outside a conference room reserved for executive meetings. Waiting inside was a woman in a navy suit organizing several neatly stacked folders. She stood as they entered. Naomi Pierce, she introduced herself with a polite smile. Legal counsel for Mr. Rourke. She placed a document on the polished walnut table. "This is a 6-month marriage agreement. You are encouraged to read every word before making any decision." Miles slowly turned each page. The language was surprisingly straightforward. Damien would receive no ownership of the Ashford estate. Miles would retain complete authority over every charitable foundation and historic property. Financial accounts would remain completely separate. Either party could terminate the agreement after 6 months without penalty unless both voluntarily chose otherwise. The final section required only one thing from Miles. He would grant Damien supervised access to the private archives inside Ashford House. Miles looked up. "Why do you want my grandfather's archives?" Damien did not answer immediately. Instead, he rested both hands lightly on the table. "Because Walter Ashford once saved my life." Miles searched his face for any hint of deception but found only quiet restraint. "My grandfather never mentioned you." "He would not have," Damien replied. "He believed some promises should remain private until the right moment." Miles glanced back at the contract. "If this is about money, there are easier ways to earn it." "It has never been about money." "Then what is it about?" Damien met his eyes. "A debt that has remained unpaid for many years." Before Miles could ask another question, his phone vibrated. June had sent a single message. "Preston is waiting outside. Be careful." Naomi noticed the concern on his face. "Is something wrong?" Miles excused himself and stepped into the hallway. Preston was already standing near the elevator with his hands folded behind his back. "You are making this unnecessarily complicated," Preston said pleasantly. "You still have time to choose the safer option." Safer for whom? Miles asked. Preston smiled without warmth. For your friend June, perhaps. Miles felt his heartbeat quicken. Leave her out of this. That depends entirely on you. Preston adjusted his cufflinks. People's careers can disappear surprisingly fast when the right paperwork reaches the right office. He turned and walked away before Miles could answer. Miles remained motionless for several seconds before returning to the conference room. He pulled a pen from his pocket, crossed out one paragraph, and wrote a new clause beneath it. Naomi read the handwritten addition aloud. Neither party may use unlawful force or intimidation against Gavin Ashford or Preston Vale unless clear legal evidence establishes criminal wrongdoing. She raised one eyebrow toward Damien. Interesting revision. Damien picked up the pen without hesitation and signed beneath the new clause. Accepted. Miles blinked, clearly surprised. You did not even argue. You wanted proof that your voice matters, Damien replied. Now you have it. Naomi slid the completed agreement across the table. One more complication, she said quietly. Every city marriage office has unexpectedly closed for the remainder of the day due to emergency administrative orders. Miles slowly looked toward Damien. Someone is trying to make sure I cannot get married before tomorrow. Damien buttoned his jacket once again and walked toward the conference room door. Then we will simply find another way before the clock reaches midnight. Naomi made 3 phone calls before lowering her tablet onto the dashboard of Damien's sedan. Every public marriage office has received the same emergency closure notice, she said. Someone planned this well in advance. Damien started the engine without showing the slightest frustration. There is still one option. Miles looked over from the passenger seat. What kind of option? An emergency judicial ceremony. It is legal under state law if a judge agrees to perform it. Naomi nodded. Judge Eleanor Brooks is finishing a late session at the county courthouse on the east side of the city. If we reach her before midnight, she can authorize everything. Miles checked the clock above the dashboard. Less than 7 hours remained. As they left downtown, traffic slowed to an unexpected crawl. Police vehicles blocked the main bridge while electronic signs announced emergency inspections. Naomi frowned as she studied the map. There were no closures 15 minutes ago. Damien took the next exit without hesitation. This was arranged. Miles watched rows of brake lights stretch for nearly a mile ahead. Do you think Gavin has enough influence to do this? Not alone, Damien replied. Someone with greater resources is helping him. They followed a narrow industrial road until another obstacle appeared. Construction barriers completely sealed the intersection. Naomi quietly exhaled. Every direct route has been closed. Damien reached for his phone, but Miles suddenly leaned forward. Wait. Both of them turned toward him. When I worked on the City Archive project last year, I catalogued transportation records from decades ago. His eyes brightened as memories connected. There is an abandoned maintenance tunnel beneath the old freight station. It links directly to the courthouse district. It has not been used for passenger traffic in years, but it should still be accessible. Damien changed direction immediately. Show me. 20 minutes later they reached the weathered brick station where faded signs still clung to cracked walls. The evening sky had turned steel gray as a cool rain began to fall. Miles led them through a side entrance covered with rusted fencing. Inside, dust floated through narrow beams of light shining from damaged ceiling panels. This way, he said confidently. The maintenance corridor runs beneath the original tracks. Naomi smiled faintly. Your memory may have just saved the day. The tunnel smelled of damp concrete and old iron, but it remained structurally sound. Their footsteps echoed through the long passage while distant trains rumbled somewhere above. Halfway through the tunnel they discovered a heavy security gate hanging partially open. Damien paused only long enough to make certain the path ahead remained clear before holding the gate steady so Miles and Naomi could pass safely. Thank you, Miles said quietly. Damien simply nodded. the silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt cooperative. When they finally emerged near the courthouse district, rain poured steadily across the empty streets. Naomi checked her watch. 11:43. They hurried toward the courthouse entrance where Judge Brooks was preparing to leave with a leather briefcase in one hand and an umbrella in the other. Naomi quickly explained the legal circumstances while presenting the necessary documents. The judge listened carefully before looking directly at Miles. "Are you entering this marriage willingly?" Miles glanced at Damien. Only hours earlier they had been complete strangers. Yet throughout the evening Damien had never pressured him, never demanded blind trust, and never treated him like property. Miles took a slow breath. "Yes. I am making this decision myself." Judge Brooks turned to Damien. "And you?" Damien answered without hesitation. "Yes." They followed the judge into a quiet courtroom illuminated by only a few overhead lights. The room felt almost timeless, its polished wooden benches empty except for Naomi and June, who had rushed across the city after receiving Miles's message. At exactly 11:53, the judge began the brief ceremony. There were no flowers, no music, and no cheering guests. Only honest words spoken beneath the seal of the court. When the judge announced that they were legally married, Miles experienced neither triumph nor regret. Instead, he felt something unexpected. Relief. 7 minutes before the deadline, the impossible had become reality. As they stepped outside, Naomi's phone vibrated sharply. She answered, listened for only a few seconds, then slowly lowered the device. Her expression lost all color. "Ashford House," she whispered. "There has been a fire." Miles stood completely still as the rain continued falling around them. The place where every childhood memory lived had suddenly become the next destination in a night that refused to stop changing. A thick column of grey smoke was still rising. Into the rainy night when Damien's car turned onto Ashford Lane. Flashing emergency lights reflected across the soaked pavement as firefighters continued directing streams of water toward the historic mansion. Miles opened the car door before it had fully stopped. "Miles, wait," June called, but he was already running toward the front gate. The familiar white stone walls that had once welcomed him home were now blackened with soot. Broken windows reflected the glow of emergency lights, and the scent of wet wood filled the cold night air. Every birthday, every holiday, every quiet afternoon spent beside his grandfather suddenly felt as though they were disappearing with the drifting smoke. A firefighter stepped into his path. "I am sorry, sir. The building is unstable." "The library," Miles said, struggling to steady his voice. "There is a private archive behind the west wall. Please. There are documents that cannot be replaced." The firefighter hesitated before shaking his head. "We cannot allow anyone inside." Miles closed his eyes. Then his fingers instinctively found the small bronze key still resting safely inside his pocket. His grandfather's final words echoed clearly in his memory. "Keep it safe until the truth needs you." He suddenly looked toward the damaged west wing. "There is a hidden room," he whispered. Damien noticed the change in his expression immediately. "What did you remember?" "The key." Miles pulled it from his pocket. "Grandpa always said it belonged to the day I would finally understand everything. I think whatever it opens is still inside." Damien studied the burning structure without speaking. Finally he turned toward the fire captain and quietly exchanged several words. The captain listened carefully before giving a reluctant nod. A small team prepared protective equipment while Damien accepted a heavy fire-resistant jacket. Miles stared at him. "You are going in?" "You cannot," Damien answered calmly. "If there is something your grandfather protected until his final day, then it deserves one last chance to survive." Before Miles could respond, Damien disappeared through the damaged entrance alongside two firefighters. Every passing minute felt impossibly long. Rain continued falling while smoke slowly thinned above the roof. June stood beside Miles without saying a word. Naomi remained focused on conversations with investigators, quietly gathering every available detail. Nearly 20 minutes later, the front doors opened again. Damien emerged carrying a scorched metal lockbox against his chest. His jacket was covered with ash, but the box remained untouched by the water inside. He carefully placed it on the hood of the car. "I believe this belongs to you." Miles inserted the bronze key into the old brass lock. It turned smoothly as though it had been waiting for this exact moment. Inside rested an old cassette recorder, half of a faded photograph, several handwritten index cards covered with reference numbers, and a sealed envelope addressed in Walter Ashford's unmistakable handwriting. To Miles. Open only when you no longer know whom to trust. His hands trembled as he unfolded the letter, but before reading it he pressed the play button on the cassette recorder. Static filled the quiet street before Walter's familiar voice slowly emerged. "If you are hearing this, then events have unfolded exactly as I feared. Someone close to our family has been helping erase the identities of vulnerable Omegas by manipulating charitable records. I gathered evidence for years, but I never finished exposing everyone involved. The names are hidden within the archive indexes. Trust the numbers before you trust people." The recording crackled. Walter continued, "If Damien Rourke is standing beside you, then know that I trusted him with my own life." The tape suddenly stopped with a sharp mechanical click. Silence settled over the group. Miles slowly lowered the recorder and turned toward Damien. "You knew he was investigating something." Damien did not deny it. "Yes. And you still never told me." "It was not my story to tell." Miles looked down at the photograph. One half showed his grandfather standing beside a much younger Damien, both smiling naturally. The missing half had been torn away years earlier. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Naomi examined the handwritten index cards. These reference numbers correspond to archived case files. June looked over her shoulder before suddenly freezing. "Miles," she said softly, "one of these codes matches a record your mother worked on shortly before her accident." Miles felt the warmth of relief from the courthouse disappear completely. The marriage had solved one deadline, but another mystery had only just begun, and for the first time since meeting Damien, he wondered whether the man standing beside him had entered his life to protect the truth or to find it before anyone else could. The rain had finally stopped by sunrise, but the smell of smoke still lingered over the remains of Ashford House. Temporary lights illuminated the damaged library while investigators carefully documented every room that could still be entered safely. Miles sat alone inside a portable office trailer with Walter's handwritten index cards spread across a folding table. Numbers filled every page. To anyone else they looked meaningless, but years of organizing forgotten collections had trained Miles to recognize hidden patterns. Every code matched a catalog system his grandfather had personally designed decades earlier. June leaned over the table. "You are seeing something, are you not?" Miles slowly nodded. "These are not random archive references. They connect financial reports, property transfers, and charitable records from the same years." His finger stopped on one specific entry. "This one belonged to my mother." Naomi entered carrying several scanned documents recovered from the surviving files. "We confirmed it," she said quietly. "Your mother reviewed multiple transactions involving the Ashford Foundation shortly before her death." Miles swallowed hard. "Everyone always told me it was just a traffic accident." Naomi hesitated before answering. "The official report still says that." The uncertainty in her voice only deepened the questions already filling the room. Damien stood silently near the window overlooking the ruined estate. He watched workers carefully carry damaged books into protective containers while saying almost nothing. Miles noticed him but deliberately returned his attention to the records. He needed facts more than reassurances. Hours later, the archive search produced another discovery. Hidden inside one surviving ledger was a receipt showing that his mother had copied dozens of financial files only 2 days before her accident. The destination field had been erased, but the date remained perfectly clear. Someone had wanted those copies. Someone had wanted them badly enough to remove every obvious trace afterward. Before anyone could continue searching, Miles received a text message from an unknown number. I know what happened to your mother. Come alone if you want the truth. The message included a location only 15 minutes away. Preston Vale's private law office. Miles stared at the screen until it dimmed. He quietly slipped the phone into his pocket without showing anyone. An hour later he left the investigation site alone, convincing June that he needed fresh clothes from his apartment. Instead he drove directly to Preston's office. The building appeared almost deserted. Preston greeted him with the same calm smile he had worn inside the hotel ballroom. I knew curiosity would bring you here, he said. Miles remained standing. You said you know what happened to my mother. Preston opened a folder and placed a single photograph on the desk. It showed a black sedan bearing the discreet emblem of the Rourke organization parked near the intersection where Miles's mother had died years earlier. Your precious husband never told you this? Preston asked softly. His people were there that night. Miles felt the room become strangely quiet. Explain. I just did. Preston folded his hands. You married the very man connected to your family's greatest tragedy. Before Miles could respond, Preston reached into his desk drawer and removed another item. There is one thing Damien still wants from your grandfather's collection. His eyes settled on Miles's pocket. The bronze key. Miles instinctively stepped backward. It stays with me. Preston sighed. That is unfortunate. At that exact moment the office light suddenly flickered. A firm knock echoed through the hallway before the front door opened. Damien entered without haste, Naomi only a few steps behind him. Neither of them raised their voices. Damien looked first at Miles, then at the photograph lying on the desk. He showed you part of the truth, Damien said quietly. Not the whole story. Miles stared at him, uncertainty filling every thought. Were you there the night my mother died? Damien answered without looking away. Yes. The single word landed heavier than any accusation. Damien continued before silence could grow into misunderstanding. Walter asked me to move her somewhere safe because she had discovered evidence against powerful people. My vehicle reached the intersection only after another driver forced her off her planned route. We tried to help. We failed. His expression remained controlled, but genuine regret softened every sentence. That failure has stayed with me ever since. Miles slowly looked from Damien to Preston. The photograph had been real, but it had never shown what happened before or after it was taken. Preston had offered a fact without the truth behind it. For the first time since the investigation began, Miles realized that every answer he found seemed carefully arranged to make him distrust the wrong person, and somewhere beyond the ruined estate, the real architect of everything was still waiting. Damien drove in complete silence until the city skyline disappeared behind rolling hills and pine trees. Nearly 2 hours later the road ended at a quiet coastal house overlooking grey waves that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. It was simple, weathered by years of salt air, and so different from the luxurious buildings Miles had imagined someone like Damien would own that he almost questioned whether they had arrived at the right place. Naomi placed a small box of recovered documents on the kitchen table before checking her phone. The investigation team confirmed someone used Gavin Ashford's security credentials to access the West Wing shortly before the fire, she said. That does not prove he started it, but it proves he was there. Damien nodded once. Continue tracing every communication between Gavin and Preston. After Naomi left to coordinate the legal team, the house became remarkably quiet. Miles wandered through the living room, noticing framed photographs instead of expensive artwork. None of them showed Damien standing alone. They showed volunteers rebuilding homes after storms, community kitchens, and youth scholarship ceremonies. There was not a single picture celebrating wealth or power. As evening settled over the shoreline, Miles stepped outside and found Damien repairing a broken wooden railing with practiced hands. I thought someone else would do that, Miles admitted. Damien smiled faintly. If I can fix it myself, I should. Miles watched him tighten the final screw before asking the question that had been growing heavier all day. Why did my grandfather trust you? Damien rested both hands on the railing and looked toward the ocean. Because many years ago, before anyone knew my name, I needed someone to believe I deserved another chance. His voice remained steady, but the memory behind it was unmistakably personal. When I was 16, I was trapped inside an organization that treated frightened young people as assets instead of human beings. Walter discovered what was happening while investigating financial records connected to charitable foundations. He helped several of us disappear before we could be forced back into that life. Miles listened without interrupting. He never asked for anything in return, Damien continued. Years later, after I built a legitimate business and gained enough influence to protect others, Walter asked me for one promise. If anything ever happened to him, and if the Ashford estate became the target of the same network he had been investigating, I was to protect you. Miles slowly lowered his eyes. So you already knew my name? Yes. And the hotel? Damien looked directly at him. Walter arranged an automated message that would be delivered after his death if the marriage condition was ever activated. I learned about the 24-hour deadline only hours before you did. Standing up in that ballroom was my decision. The honesty in his answer settled something inside Miles that suspicion had kept unsettled for days. Later that evening they carried Walter's lockbox into the study. Naomi joined them. Through a secure video call while Miles carefully examined the bronze key beneath a magnifying lamp. There is a seam here, he observed. Using a small precision tool from the desk drawer, he gently separated the two halves of the key. Hidden inside rested a tiny biometric data chip. Naomi's eyes widened through the screen. That is not an ordinary storage device. Damien inserted the chip into an encrypted reader. A password request immediately appeared before the system prompted for a blood verification link to the Ashford family line. Miles carefully completed the verification. The screen filled with encrypted folders before stopping at a single message. Archiving complete. Remaining records stored on primary Ashford Foundation server. Access restricted. Naomi leaned closer to her monitor. The complete evidence is still inside the Foundation network. Miles nodded slowly. Which Gavin currently controls. Damien folded his arms thoughtfully. Then we stop reacting and start planning. Together they built a careful strategy. Publicly they would appear divided, allowing Gavin and Preston to believe the marriage was collapsing under pressure. Privately they would use that false impression to gain access to the Foundation server before anyone realized they were working together. As the meeting ended and Naomi disconnected, silence returned once again. Miles stood beside the open window listening to the waves. Without thinking, he reached out and lightly took Damien's hand. There was no urgency, no obligation, and no expectation hidden inside the simple gesture. Damien looked at their joined hands with quiet surprise before meeting Miles's eyes. Neither of them spoke. For the first time since the impossible 24-hour countdown had begun, trust no longer felt like another condition written into a contract. It felt like a choice both of them had finally made. The following morning began with careful preparation instead of celebration. News reports across the city focused on the mysterious fire at Ashford House and the unexpected marriage that had changed control of the estate overnight. Exactly as Damien had predicted, public attention shifted away from the missing archive records and toward speculation about their relationship. That distraction gave them a narrow opportunity to move. Naomi arrived before sunrise carrying a secure laptop and several sealed folders. Her expression was unusually serious. "We have another problem," she said quietly. She placed her phone on the kitchen table and played a short video message. June appeared on the screen with her hands tied behind a chair inside a dim warehouse. She looked frightened but unharmed. A distorted voice spoke from somewhere behind the camera. "Bring the data chip and sign over the Ashford Foundation before sunset. If you involve the authorities, your friend disappears forever." The screen went black. Miles immediately stood. "We have to find her." Damien remained calm as he replayed the recording. "We will." "Then let us leave now." "Not yet." Miles stared at him in disbelief. Not yet. Damien paused the video and enlarged a single frame showing a cracked warehouse wall. If we rush toward the location they want us to see, we will lose both June and the evidence. Miles folded his arms. How can you be so certain? Damien pointed toward the corner of the image. Listen instead of looking. He replayed the audio. Beneath the distorted voice, a distant metallic bell rang 3 times. Naomi immediately understood. Freight crossing signals. Miles frowned. There are freight crossings all over the city. Not with seagulls in the background, Damien answered. The recording was made near the Eastern Harbor. Miles listened again, closing his eyes this time. Suddenly another memory surfaced. The train schedule. He hurried to the recovered archive indexes and compared several handwritten codes. These numbers are not only financial references. They match old shipping routes that Grandpa documented during his investigation. His finger stopped on one line. The Eastern Cargo Terminal. Naomi smiled for the first time that morning. The video is a distraction. June is somewhere else. Damien immediately adjusted their plan. Naomi would quietly coordinate a rescue team toward the harbor while he and Miles continued with the original strategy. Publicly they would appear divided. Gavin needed to believe Miles had lost faith in Damien. That afternoon a charity gala hosted by the Ashford Foundation filled one of the city's largest museums with donors, politicians, and business executives. Gavin greeted guests confidently, convinced the public attention had shifted entirely in his favor. Miles entered alone exactly as planned. Damien remained outside the building where photographers could easily notice his absence. Inside the ballroom, Gavin approached with carefully rehearsed sympathy. I was sorry to hear about the fire, he said. Some tragedies simply cannot be prevented. Miles met his gaze. Neither can some investigations. For the briefest moment Gavin's smile disappeared. He quietly guided Miles toward a private office overlooking the museum gardens. You have always been intelligent, Gavin admitted. Perhaps intelligent enough to understand that some choices protect more people than others. Miles looked directly at him. You delayed my inheritance notice. Gavin lowered his eyes. Yes. Why? Gavin sank into a chair that suddenly made him appear much older than before. Because someone threatened my son years ago. I convinced myself I could cooperate just long enough to keep him safe. He hesitated before continuing. Then the money became easier to accept than the guilt. Before Miles could respond, the office door burst open. Preston entered breathing heavily, his polished appearance finally cracked by impatience. We are out of time, he snapped. He looked toward Gavin with open frustration. He already knows too much. Gavin stood in alarm. This is not what we agreed. Preston ignored him completely. His attention settled on the inside pocket of Miles's jacket where the bronze key rested hidden beside the biometric chip. Give it to me, he said quietly. Everything depends on that key. Miles instinctively stepped backward as voices from the ballroom continued beyond the closed office door, completely unaware that every carefully hidden secret inside the Ashford family was beginning to collapse all at once. Preston's demand hung in the air for only a moment before a calm voice answered from the hallway. That key was never yours to claim. Damien stepped into the private office with measured confidence, his expression unreadable despite the tension filling the room. Several gala guests paused outside the open doorway, curious but unaware of the true significance of what was unfolding. Preston forced a polite smile. You always arrive at inconvenient moments. Damien ignored the remark and looked directly at Miles. Are you all right? Miles gave a slight nod. I am. Gavin lowered himself into a chair, exhaustion replacing the confidence he had displayed only minutes earlier. It has gone too far, he murmured. It should have ended years ago. Preston turned sharply toward him. You were paid to follow instructions, not to lose your nerve. That single sentence told Miles everything he needed to know. Gavin had never been the architect of the conspiracy. He had been manipulated by someone far more powerful. Naomi's phone suddenly vibrated. She answered immediately, listened for several seconds, then looked toward Damien. June is safe. The rescue team found her at the Eastern Cargo Terminal exactly where the archive codes predicted. She is shaken, but she is unharmed. Relief washed across Miles, but Damien remained focused. Good. Begin the second phase. Preston frowned. Second phase. Damien calmly removed a small encrypted drive from his pocket and placed it on the desk. You believed the bronze key contained everything. It never did. Miles reached into his jacket and carefully removed the key before separating it into two pieces. Hidden inside, the biometric chip reflected the overhead lights. Preston instinctively stepped forward, but Damien quietly raised one hand, stopping him without physical confrontation. Walter Ashford expected someone to chase this device, Damien said. He designed it accordingly. Naomi connected the chip to her secure tablet. A verification request appeared once again. Miles placed his thumb against the sensor, allowing the system to recognize his family credentials. The display illuminated with a new message that none of them had seen before. Final authorization accepted. External transmission beginning. Preston stared at the screen. No, Naomi quickly understood what Walter had planned decades earlier. This was never just a storage device, she said with growing amazement. It is an automated release system. Files began transferring across the screen. Every financial record, every hidden transaction, every altered identity, and every erased charitable account moved simultaneously toward multiple independent destinations. Prosecutors, investigative journalists, financial regulators, historical archives. Walter had designed the system so that no single person could bury the truth once the correct heir activated it. Preston reached for the tablet, but Damien calmly stepped between him and the desk. It is finished, he said. The truth belongs to everyone now. At that exact moment another voice echoed from the office entrance. Not quite. Every head turned toward a distinguished man in a dark overcoat who entered with quiet confidence. Miles recognized him only from old newspaper photographs. Silas Vane. The name Walter had hidden behind years of coded records. Vane glanced at the transmitting files with visible disappointment rather than panic. Walter was always more creative than I expected, he admitted. His eyes settled on Damien. You have become exactly the man he hoped you would become. Damien answered evenly. And you became exactly the man he warned us about. Vane smiled faintly. Perhaps. But there is still one choice left. He looked toward Miles. Tell your husband to step aside, surrender the device, and the rest of this evening can end peacefully. Instead of answering immediately, Damien slowly removed his watch and placed it on the desk before taking one deliberate step forward. Then, to everyone's surprise, he lowered himself onto one knee. Miles stared in disbelief. So did Preston. Even Vane seemed briefly confused. Damien kept his eyes on Miles rather than anyone else. Trust me, he said quietly. Hidden beneath the face of his watch, a tiny green indicator flashed once. 100%. The transmission had finished. At that same instant the museum's automatic fire suppression system unexpectedly activated throughout the building, releasing a curtain of cool water that instantly obscured the room behind a shimmering veil. Security officers rushed toward the office while alarms echoed through every hallway. Naomi calmly secured the completed data drive. June entered moments later beside investigators who had arrived carrying official warrants based on the documents Walter's system had already delivered. Vane looked around the room, finally realizing the evidence had spread beyond anyone's ability to erase it. Miles understood then that the greatest victory had never been winning an argument or protecting an inheritance. It had been ensuring that the truth could no longer disappear. 3 months later, the first rays of autumn sunlight spilled across the restored gardens of Ashford House, transforming what had once been a burned and broken estate into a place filled with quiet laughter and renewed purpose. The Grand Library had been rebuilt with careful attention to every detail Walter Ashford had loved, while an entirely new wing welcomed Omega support programs, legal counseling offices, and temporary housing for families starting over. The tragedy that had nearly erased the Ashford legacy had instead become the reason it would endure for generations. Across the country, the evidence released through Walter's hidden system had reshaped countless investigations. Silas Vane now faced public trials supported by financial records that could no longer be hidden. Preston Vale accepted responsibility for his role in manipulating legal documents and misleading innocent people, providing testimony that helped investigators untangle years of corruption. Gavin Ashford survived the collapse of his carefully built deception as well, openly admitting that fear and greed had slowly convinced him to betray the very family he once promised to protect. His confession did not erase the damage he had caused, but it finally gave many unanswered questions the honesty they deserved. Miles often thought about how differently everything could have ended if even one piece of Walter's plan had failed. Instead, every coded record, every carefully hidden clue, and every impossible decision had led him toward the truth his grandfather had spent years protecting. June had fully recovered and now directed the outreach division of the Ashford Foundation, helping vulnerable families find legal resources before they reached moments of desperation. Naomi remained the Foundation's chief legal advisor, designing safeguards that ensured no single person could ever manipulate the charity again. The rebuilt estate no longer belonged to one family alone. It belonged to every person whose future Walter had hoped to defend. Late one afternoon, Damien arrived carrying a plain envelope instead of flowers or gifts. He found Miles arranging books inside the restored library exactly where Walter's old reading chair once stood. Without saying a word, Damien placed the envelope on the table between them. Miles opened it slowly. Inside rested signed legal papers dissolving their marriage agreement. Every signature had already been completed. Damien had left only one line blank. Miles looked up in surprise. "You already signed everything." Damien nodded. "The original contract accomplished its purpose. Your inheritance is secure. You are completely free." Miles searched his face. "You are not asking me to stay." A gentle smile appeared for only a moment. "If you remain beside me, I want it to be because you choose me. Not because of a deadline. Not because of a promise I made to your grandfather. Not because of fear." Silence settled comfortably between them. Miles remembered standing beneath the enormous chandelier only months earlier, convinced that his future would be decided by strangers. He remembered believing that marriage had become another legal condition forced upon him. Now every condition had disappeared. There were no contracts left to honor. No inheritance left to protect. No hidden investigations demanding sacrifice. Only choice. That evening the restored Ashford house welcomed hundreds of guests for the official opening of its new community center. Families toured the gardens while children laughed beneath rows of newly planted maple trees. Reporters gathered once again, but this time they came to celebrate rather than speculate. Miles stepped onto the small outdoor stage and looked across the crowd before speaking. "Several months ago, I believed safety depended on finding someone before time ran out. I know now that real safety comes from people who protect your freedom to choose your own future." His eyes found Damien standing quietly near the back of the audience. Miles stepped down from the stage, walked through the crowd, and stopped directly in front of him. From his pocket he removed a simple silver ring. "The first time we married," Miles said softly, "the law made the decision before either of us truly understood each other. Today there are no deadlines, no contracts, and no conditions." He held out the ring with steady hands. "So this time, I am the one asking. Damien Rourke, will you build the rest of your life with me?" Damien looked at the ring, then at Miles, and finally smiled with a warmth that no courtroom, contract, or inheritance could ever have created. "Only if you are completely certain." Miles laughed quietly, his eyes shining with peaceful confidence. "For the first time in my life, I truly am. As applause filled the restored gardens, the old bronze key rested inside a glass display near the library entrance beneath a small engraved plaque carrying Walter Ashford's final lesson for everyone who walked through those doors. The truth should never belong to the powerful alone. It should always belong to those willing to protect one another. What would you have done if you were in this situation? Tell us in the comments. If you love Alpha and Omega stories filled with passion, loyalty, heartbreak, and second chances, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story.